So, so I want to talk a little bit about, so I thought that is really great. So one is about causes and the other is about goals. I do want to talk about this concept of culture, and then what is cultural competence. So first of all, what typically do we talk about or refer to when we refer to culture? What are we talking about? What would you say?
Well, I think of culture, one of the ways I come into the conversation about culture is through literature and music and arts and those kinds of things. And they're like traditions and habits.
Okay.
And I think of environment.
Okay.
Which kind of fits in with what you're saying.
So a model that I like to use is the iceberg theory of culture, and I think you both are correct in your assumptions, right? There are things that we refer to as artifacts,
Yeah.
or things you can see. There's typically, when I'm dealing with high school students, I talk about things you can see, or the artifacts of culture. And typically, what are some of those artifacts of culture? What are the things that we notice that are different in every culture, but
Symbols.
so symbols.
Yeah.
Give me an example of a symbol.
I'm thinking particularly of architecture.
Okay.
Or religious symbols, the Star of David, cross, those come to mind immediately.
Okay, so religious symbols, architecture. So some places make pueblos.
Yes.
Some do yurka
Igloos.
yurka tents.
Yeah.
The pillars in terms of the
Oh,
major
yeah.
construction of the Greeks and the Romans, that kind of stuff.
Or Stonehenge.
Or Stonehenge,
Yeah.
right? So those are symbols or architectural structures. What else? What are some other artifacts?
Well, the artifacts that the anthropologists dig up, coins and pottery and weapons and tools.
Coins, pottery, weapons, tools,
Things that you'd use every day.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So how do I know the difference, just looking at artifacts, how do I know the difference between a Mexican restaurant, an Ethiopian restaurant, and a Korean restaurant? What are some of the artifacts that are pretty apparent?
How they flavor the food.
Okay, so how they flavor the food. So food could be considered an artifact, right? The way that people dress could be considered an artifact.
The way the restaurant is.
Decor.
Uh-huh. So language, decor,
Whether you're expected to eat with utensils or your fingers.
right?
There you
So
go.
all of those,
Yep.
so some of those social norms
Yeah.
are
that's a
things that
nice-
we can see. People's race or perceived race or their gender,
Mhm.
right? So all of these artifacts are the things that we see. What typically happens, though, is that these artifacts, left without any additional context, become stereotypes.
Mhm.
So now when I see certain symbols or see certain images or see certain dresses, because I don't have a greater context, or my context has been limited by my exposure to these groups, then I say that all of these people in some way are the same or are similar to the limited context that I have. Right? So so those things can be mistaken as stereotypes. Now, one of the things, and the reason I like this iceberg metaphor is because of the movie Titanic, right? So what was it that actually did end this unsinkable ship outside of pride and arrogance?
The
Right?
iceberg.
So it was in fact the iceberg, but they could see the iceberg, could they not?
I don't know, wasn't it night?
I'm not sure, but the point of the iceberg concept is what's above, what's visible is minuscule compared to the
Compared to-
mass that was
right.
under, unseen mass.
Right, and so I make the assumption that they were able to at least see the icebergs, because it wasn't just one, I mean, there
Oh, yeah,
were
plural.
tons out
Yep.
there, right? But what was underneath was not readily available to them in terms of information. And it was actually these shards under the water that actually ripped the hull of the ship, right? And their pride and their, self-centeredness added to that. And so what I typically refer to these things as things that you can't see, or values. And so the values actually give the context for these artifacts. So the artifact, people don't just do stuff because, they don't just dress the way they do because they just think it's a good idea. There's usually some kind of contextual framework. For example, Muslim and Arab women who wear the hijab, right? Or the headdress. That comes from a context. They don't just do it because they thought it was a good idea. And maybe some folks do it now, but the original intent was to carry out some kind of purpose, right? And so what are some of the values that people have that influence these outward appearances of these symbols, or the way people dress, the food that they cook? What are some of the values that people hold?
Specific values?
Yeah.
Or are you
So-
talking about
so
broad
for like-
categories like religious values or family values?
Yeah, let's start there.
Okay.
Right? So when we talk about under here, we can talk about religious values. So we have the symbols up here, but the real
Right.
meaning of those symbols comes from the religious values, right? What are some other values that you will only know if you're a part of this culture, or that is readily available to you when you're a part of the culture?
What I'm thinking of is gender values, because they can vary dramatically from
Right.
subculture to subculture.
Right. So and another way to talk about gender values is to talk about gender roles.
Yes.
And those are on the spectrum, and they changed given a number of different things, right, around culture. So gender roles. So we see gender in we see dress, we see relationships, we see even symbols that relate directly to gender roles, right? Certain symbols mean certain things. What are some other things? Or some larger concepts that you can only know if you're a part of this culture, or is readily available to you as a part of the culture?
Well, gender roles are that's such a huge concept. Gender roles can be how men and women relate to each other, or they can be what constitutes a real man, or what constitutes a real woman, or what's the place in the family of girls,
Yeah.
what's the place of boys, what's the relationship between the uncles and their nieces and nephews. So all of those family relationships are gender related in some way.
Yeah, so family relationships, those would all fall under this larger category. I'd also say that some of these symbols come out of the core values of things like time. What time means, right? So some folks believe on being on time. Some people believe in being in time, right? And so that can be a real rubbing spot for folks if we haven't defined what time means. I know that when certain friends call me and say, be there at 7 o'clock, I know I really shouldn't expect them to be there until about 7:45, right?
Because they have a different.
Because their concept of time and their value of what they think time means for them is different. But I've learned to know that about my certain friends, right? Or that you'll have a friend that's 15 minutes early to things, and so you learn how to deal with that. What do you think might be some in terms of time and how cultures have come to understand time, what do you think might be some influences on how people have been able to interpret time or make meaning of time? How has time come to have different meanings for folks?
Well, what I'm thinking of is historically, in an agrarian culture, time was measured literally by the seasons of the year. And that's a very broad category of time. Once we got into the Industrial Revolution, where time is money, then the attitude toward time changed a lot from one of the seasons of the calendar, not the calendar year, but the astronomical. It's very different when you go into a factory and you're being paid by the hour.
Yeah, when time became about money, it certainly put a different kind of emphasis on it. But even in cultures where we looked at the farming seasons, even they had a different approach to time, right? So in equatorial regions, were they really concerned about growing seasons or time? Not a whole lot, because you could grow something just about year-round, right? As we move away from the equatorial regions and we start moving towards the poles, we start getting into places where it is a necessity to make sure that we pay attention to the seasons. And so time becomes more valuable, which then gives birth to this concept of kind of what happens in the Industrial Revolution around attaching a dollar amount to time. And so, where people are on the globe has a lot to do with this definition of time.
Tell a little story about this. There was an Algonquin American Indian tribe in the New England that had no word in their language for time, in the sense of an hour or half an hour or whatever. And one of these indigenous women was making a basket, and a tourist said to her, "How long does it take to make a basket?" And she looked at him like, "What kind of a question is that? It takes as long as it takes."
Mm-hmm.
That's
The
right.
basket knows I have to honor
The
the basket.
That's right.
Totally different idea of time.
Yeah, yeah.
And not even to have hour, minute, second vocabulary would change your whole understanding of time.
One of the things that it becomes problematic, particularly with our criminal justice system, is when we get people who have a different orientation to what justice is, what time is, what separation from society is. And so one of the things, I was talking with one of my Native friends, and we were talking about how the criminal justice system doesn't serve Native Americans very well, because for Native Americans, one place in time is no different than any other place in time. So whether I'm in jail, whether I'm in the community, whether I'm on vacation, the physical place where I am is no different than any other physical place. And so typically in Western thought, we think about those being separated from the group as being punishment, where for the individuals that he has talked to and that are in his community, he said it's no different than being any other place. One place is the same as any other place. And so when we talk about how we try to punish people by creating the separation, it's hard to